I welcome all of you to our panel discussion from the series on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. These discussions are brought to you by Diversify and Herspace, and today we shall be discussing the topic of ableism. We have some amazing panelists with us here today, and before we all get to know them, once the introductions will be on, I'm just going to make sure to mute my notifications. But let me just jump into a quick introduction of myself. So for those of you who have been following us for some time, my face and my voice might be familiar. I have been away for a while, but I'm glad to be back and have the honor to guide you all through this panel discussion as the moderator. My name is Susanna Warden. I am a project and research manager at Diversify with professional background in social work and inclusive development cooperation with a focus on women empowerment and inclusion of persons with disabilities. So this topic of ableism is very close to my heart. And for those in our audience with visual impairments, we also like to introduce ourselves by describing our looks. So I am a white woman with quite a pale oval face, brown eyes, brown lipstick, and long brown dreadlocks. I'm wearing a beige shirt, black blazer, and I have a yellow background. So that is me. Oh no. Shayantani, my laptop went off.
We can see you, Susanna.
Oh, okay, I'm very sorry. So technical issues on this side. My screen just went blank, so I cannot see anything. I'm sorry. So maybe you can start introducing yourselves, and I'm just gonna handle this by borrowing a laptop from my colleague.
Okay, maybe I get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Chisom Daisy. I am an economist and the founder of Diversify, also a DEI strategist and enthusiast. So I'm happy to be here. I am a Black woman with brown skin. I am wearing a gray turtleneck shirt. I have twists on my hair, and you might, with some colors. I have some white and blondish highlights in my hair. The what do you call it? The wall behind me is my usual gray, boring white wall where nothing, no flowers, no colors. Probably worth also mentioning, I think it should be fine, but I have pregnancy brain fog at the moment. So sometimes I don't say the right words that I mean to say, but I think we should be fine today. So happy to be here. Bernard, you want to go next?
Sure. Hello everyone. My name is Bernard Shira. I am the director at Innovate Now. Innovate Now is a startup accelerator based in Nairobi, Kenya. And we focus on driving innovation in the area of assistive technology, which entails products and services that serve people with disabilities, older people, and generally everyone, because disability is a human reality that affects us all. I am wearing a very yellow hoodie with the logo of our accelerator, written IN. I have a short black hair, brown skin, and I think my wall is equally boring, like Chisholm's. So it's a grayish white wall. But I hope this conversation will be as bright as my hoodie. So happy to have you join us and looking forward to the conversation.
We are happy to have you here as well, Bernard. Sorry for the technical hiccup on my side. I guess I should throw my laptop out of the window after this session and get a new one. Kaisa, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so my name is Kaisa Ledvik, and I work for a company called Avanade. I'm a director there. I also lead the analytics talent community. So data warehouse, any kind of AI, that's what I do as my main job. I also work quite a lot with inclusion and diversity. I am the Norway inclusion and diversity lead, used to be the Nordic one, but we're sort of rotating that as actually as part of making career opportunities. And I also lead an employee network inside of Avanade on the European level, which is called Diversibility, which is all about disability inclusion. My, let's say, claim to disability fame is I have something called stilsdisease. In Norwegian it's called barneleddgikt, or juvenile arthritis is like a more descriptive thing. I've had that since I was 4, but it's only over the recent like 2 or 3 years that I've really talked about this, due to probably topics I'm certain we will come back to exactly why I would not talk about that for like 40 years. Yeah, that's me. Yes, and description. Pale skin, gray eyes. My hair is currently a weird mix of purple, brown, and white, signifying my age and also love for colors. But I am wearing a black shirt, so I don't know. Black top. My background is currently blurred because I sit at my home office and there is a bookcase behind me, but it's very busy. So I just blurred it for today. So yeah, that's me.
More interesting than my background and Bernard's background, Kasia.
Yes, so thank you so much all for introducing yourselves. I think without further ado, we can just jump straight into the questions.
You are unmuted.
As I mentioned earlier, we are today discussing the topic of ableism. So just to lay the foundation for this conversation, the conversations on disability inclusion are becoming relatively more common, but they're still far away from where they need to be. And the topic of ableism is hardly known or discussed even by DEI practitioners. We actually had a short meeting today, and the person we talked to actually said that before seeing the topic of our session, they were not even aware that there was something called ableism. So I think this is a very important session to have. So I think we should start with the basics. What is a disability? And what is ableism, and how does it fit into the topic of disability inclusion? Now, these two questions are open for all of our panelists. So whoever feels like they would like to answer this, you are welcome. I see Bernard is unmuted. Do you want to start, Bernard? What is a disability? What is ableism, and how does it fit into disability inclusion?
All right, thank you. Okay, let's start with disability. So I think there are many definitions and understandings of disability that have come along and schools of thought. But the way I love to define disability is to consider some elements of all these schools of thought. So I'll quickly mention the schools of thought. So there's a medical model of disability that really focuses on the person with an impairment, and it kind of just focuses on, okay, the best way to solve this is to improve the impairment, or like improve the ability of the person, and it's obviously from the medical world, because this is where most of us with disability interact with the medical world quite often. So we can go for treatments and for surgeries and things like this. And there's a whole world around rehabilitation that's related to this, which in itself is a good thing, because it is about enabling someone with a disability to go back, to a state of being able to do what they used to do. And then there's another model that kind of looks at it from a barrier perspective, and they call this the social model of disability. So they look at disability as this occurrence of the interaction of someone with an impairment with a world that was not designed for them. So what is seen as a disability is as a result of that interaction. And there is a human rights model and definition of disability as well. And it first of all looks at it as a human issue. I mean, it looks at it as an issue affecting a human being, and kind of tries to elevate this from a rights perspective, and to say that persons with disabilities and their needs and their rights are human rights, which is something I do agree with. And there is an old model, very old model, that's charity model, that has been in existence for quite a long. And it does come from a good place because they want to help, but it's from the approach of charity and doing what is good. So I mean, as you can hear, all these models have a thing here, a thing there that kind of makes sense, but it's not really comprehensive, or you wouldn't say that they truly nail it. So I think for us to truly kind of define disability, we'd have to take what makes sense from all these definitions and come up with a definition that is relevant to our world today. And so while that is not very easy to do, and at the risk of defining disability all over again, I think what I'd love us to focus on is, one, that persons with disabilities and the disability itself is a human reality that has been there, will always be there. And that, it affects anyone who identifies as human being. So whether you have a disability now or not, what makes disability a very interesting human aspect is the fact that anyone could get a disability at any point in their life, whether that's by birth, whether that's through an impairment that happens, out of a disease, or even an accident. So instead of looking at this from, okay, how do we solve disability or eliminate disability, we just need to realize that it is a human experience, okay? And it being a human experience, our focus should be equality, equity, and looking at all who are affected in one way or another as human beings, and do what's in their best interests. And I'm gonna stop there because I know I risk talking too much, and we have a wonderful panelists here. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So maybe to sum it up from what you said, so disability, from your understanding, from your perspective, is a human experience, an interaction between the person's impairment and their environment, which might pose a lot of obstacles to their full participation in the society. Can I say that?
Yeah.
All right, so there was a second part of the question though, and that was, what is ableism and how does it fit into the topic of disability inclusion? Now, Kaisa or Chisom, which one of you would like to answer this?
I'm happy to at least start, and Chisom can probably follow up. For me, ableism is to always expect that everybody can do the same thing, that everybody has the same level of function, and also so that is one thing, but also to be a little bit annoyed that not everybody in the crowd can do everything that you expect them to be able to do. You know, you expect a person to have like 2 arms, 2 legs, and they should all be working, and you should be able to do, you know, continue to do things for a long time, and your brain is always, you know, wired the same way. And then be you know, express negativity towards those who do not necessarily have full capacity on the physical sense, a mental sense, or that your brain is wired slightly differently, so it means that you process things differently. And so being, you know, atypical, and not being necessarily naturally able to do everything that society expects you to do. For me, that is ableism. And how it fits into disability inclusion is that you, as you already mentioned, is like you need to be aware of the fact that there is a thing called ableism in order to understand why disability inclusion is important, because you have to sort of negate that negative thing. You need to make sure that people understand ableism for them to bother doing adjustments, because just going with the sort of, well, the typical thing is this is normal, you know, everybody can do this thing. It means that whenever you have somebody who can't, and you make adjustments, you need to take that into consideration in order to be inclusive. So when you're planning activities, you kind of need to have a little bit of an idea of, are we being inclusive in this activity? Do we know if somebody has any kind of physical disabilities when we are planning to do something that involves a lot of physical activity? Do we have somebody who has some cognitive, let's say, these words are difficult, but cognitive, let's say, disadvantages? I don't know if that's a very good word, but you know, if you're doing a lot of cognitive work, but you may have somebody in the group who has, for a shorter or longer time, some issues with that, it is more challenging, then maybe that's not a very fun activity to be part of. And that creates exclusion if you can't really participate, because somebody didn't really think about. There may be a variety of function, physical, mental, or neuro function here. Chisholm.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just to, I think to add to that, I just wanted to say first, perhaps on disability, one of the things I also wanted to mention is that it's also worth noting that most of us at one point or the other in our life will be disabled. And sometimes it could be on a temporary basis. So it's worth knowing that beyond being born with it or having an accident that renders it permanent, it can also happen for a few months, for example. I think in terms of ableism, I tend to think about ableism from the perspective of, you know, say, you know, discrimination or prejudice that people face within a very normative world of that is ableist. So where resources that are provided in society or in the workplace are catered to people who do not have any type of disabilities that limits you know, their interactions with the world, and how ableism fits into disability. I think about it from the context of, you know, how it shows up in language. I think sometimes even like in the daily languages that we use in conversing, how it's been passively accepted, and how physical conditions or traits of people are reduced to insults or things that are not cool, for example. And I think we'll talk a bit more about this, but think about, you know, words like, you know, are you blind? Why aren't you doing that the right way? or, oh, that's so lame, you know, or, oh my gosh, I'm so spastic, you know, and we're all, you know, none of us are free from this preconceived, you know, language. And even for people who have disabilities, you know, they might also end up using languages such as this. I think one lesson I'd like to say in terms of disability is beyond the physical or invisible condition. One of the reasons why it's also a disability is based on the interactions with the world. So it's not so much that I am a disabled person, it's also that the world has not created resources to accommodate for my unique situation. And that makes me disabled because I'm not able to access that building because there is no ramp, or I'm not able to access the third floor because there are no elevators, or I can't use the bathroom because there are no bathrooms for people with disabilities. So also just to think about it in terms of how we interact with the world, not only based on, you know, our physical or non-visible situations.
Thank you so much, Chisholm, and all of you. You have actually all touched upon other questions that we have prepared for you. And actually, Bernard, you have already answered the question I have prepared for you in here, because I wanted to ask you to explain the difference between the medical and social model of disability for us, but you've already done that. So I hope it's okay if we skip that, and I will jump into the next question, which we have for Kaisa. Kaisa, from a workplace perspective, what are some of the ways that ableism shows up, say in recruitment, in organizational culture, in policies? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of different things, and we are learning as an organization, to be honest, to be more mindful, because you have so one thing is like the physical disabilities, making sure that we have an accessible work environment. You know, that's kind of like, it's simple to some extent because it's very physical, it's there. If you have a coworker who sits in a wheelchair, you will need to consider, do we have any steps? Do we have, our toilets, are they accessible? How can we make it accessible? And you can't really ignore the fact that you have somebody who sits in a wheelchair. But then if you have somebody who has a hearing impairment, you know, it's not necessarily visible. And making sure that your meetings will maybe need to be structured a little bit differently. There needs to be more text. There needs to be, you can't really have discussions going around all because the person who has the hearing impairment, even if they have an interpreter maybe present, you know, there's a lot of things that you may not be able to do. And then what we also see is the sort of something that may work for one type of disability may be very problematic for others. Like if everything happens in text, the person who may be dyslexic will have some issues. And you know, so being aware, and probably being aware of what kind of adjustments needs to happen, and being very mindful of are any of these, you know, going against each other. It's the same with things like PowerPoint presentations. So I'm a consultant. We do a lot of PowerPoint presentations. Are PowerPoint templates that we are supposed to use, have they been through the sort of whole accessibility editing? Or are we causing problems for people with visual impairment because of our templates? Because they are not set up as they should be. And then on the other hand, some things that may work for people with who are hard of seeing may be problematic for people who again, with dyslexia. Because they're like some tricks that work from one thing, and then they will be problematic for others. We also see it like in hiring processes or anything that can be a little bit sort of wobbly. Some people who are neurodivergent may have more issues with things that jump about and not, you know, you are changing an interview time to fit something that because the interviewers couldn't do it at the point of time that you kind of agreed to, but then you just change it. I hear from my autistic coworkers that will trip them up. You know, for me who's neurotypical, that isn't really an issue, and I may not be aware that that really puts somebody else on a disadvantage. And really being aware of how neurodiversity looks versus neurotypical. I think that's one of the most important things I've learned over the last 1 or 2 years when I really dug into it. And that's something that I think all organizations really need to take in to be aware of. And any kind of hidden disability is under discussed kind of thing because it's invisible. You don't see it, and then you are not mindful.
Yeah, we usually just tend to address what hits us right in the face. It's a human way of doing things. But Bernard and Chisom, maybe do you have any examples to add quickly? Any examples of how ableism shows in, let's say, recruitment, organizational culture, policies?
I think there's a bit about expectations as well. And I think maybe we'll talk about this later, is having an expectation of how a neurodiverse person should present or how a person with disability should present. And then when they present differently from that, oh gosh, something has to be wrong with them, you know? And I think like within recruitment, for example, awareness goes a long way in terms of, you know, what our expectations are of people. I've spoken to quite a number of recruitment managers who, you know, when they're having you know, in terms of when you're interviewing people, like what is the push to who you decide to bring on for the next interview or hire? And they say things like, it's my gut feeling. You know, if I try to get to know them beyond the questions that have been asked, you know, do they look me in the eye? How firm is their handshake? Things like this. And I'm thinking, oh, wow. How very ableist, because some people, depending on which spectrum they're in or their neurodiversity, do not necessarily want to engage with you with, you know, that stern eye contact, like let's do the death stare and see who loses it first, or, you know, might also interact differently. I think even in terms of like tests that are given, especially these standardized tests of different kinds, or there are some employment processes that requires you to make a video interview and answer questions, things like this, where it is not always inclusive for people who have disabilities or people who are neurodiverse. So there are different ways you can basically unpack how this kind of shows up in the workplace or in recruitment processes, and how people are so unaware at how, on one hand, you're trying to standardize recruitment process, which is great, so you reduce bias, but are you also including a group of people that are so severely not thought of quite often? So oftentimes people with disabilities are not thought about, you know, it's like a last resource, unless you have somebody with disability in the room who advocates for that need. Or sometimes people who are neurodiverse, and especially when you're neurodiverse or you have an invisible disability and you do not disclose, there are no provisions for that. So yeah, it shows up in a lot of different ways.
Thank you for adding that, Chisom. I think we can actually continue on something that you have already started discussing, because my next question is for you. Your work is a lot about advocacy. And, you know, most of the topics that you talk about, you tend to bring on equity and intersectionality as a very important lens to use within our daily lives, but also work. So I wanted to ask you, what does it take to dismantle ableism in the workplace and society at large? I know it's a huge question. Maybe if you can try to answer that in like 4 minutes, that would be perfect. I'm super ableist now.
Right. So few definitions maybe. So equity is recognizing that we need different things to arrive at the same point. So without equity, you cannot arrive at equality. So for me, while equality is very important, I always focus on an equity perspective in the work that I do. And then intersectionality is understanding that we have different layers of our identities that makes us interact with the world in different ways. So never just one thing, like I'm not just a woman, or not just like a DEI strategist or a mom or a Black person, like I'm a combination of all these different things that I am. So the question in terms of how, what it takes to dismantle ableism in society or in the workplace, I think we need to also look at a lot of inclusion and diversity efforts. I think a lot of inclusion and diversity efforts fit within a box. And usually those boxes are oppressive inherently. Those boxes need to first be dismantled because we can do inclusion and we can do diversity, but it needs to be within this colonial, frame that we have created of what is the right way to do inclusion, what is the right way to include people with disabilities. So this is something that needs to be dismantled because they are inherently oppressive. And then also going back to the one size fits all approach, like let's just create this one thing to appease all the people with disabilities in the workplace. And this is not usually, how things should be done. Also thinking about it from the perspective of people should not need to disclose their disability or their neurodiversity for workplaces to be able to create accessible structures that maybe we can't have universal accessibility, but we can come pretty close by, trying to design for those who are most marginalized. And I think one other way as well that I can think of right now in terms of how we can dismantle this is thinking about how people with, disability or say a neurodiversity show up in the world, recognizing that people with disabilities are not a monolith. They have different experiences and they have different ways in which they interact with their disability or their neurodiversity. So if we take somebody, for example, who is in a wheelchair, what person A needs might be completely different from what person B needs. So in terms of just how we're dismantling this is, how we dismantle this is in basically trying to include in the design and in the solutions we put forward the people for which that solutions are meant for.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was a beautiful answer. Oftentimes when we talk about ableism and disability inclusion, the topic of accessibility comes in. So Bernard, I have a question for you. What is accessibility and how can companies work to create an accessible physical and mental workplace for their employees?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think first of all, it's really difficult to create accessibility without addressing or having a good understanding of inclusion and disability inclusion itself. So I think what you've discussed is really the foundation. But to your question, accessibility is basically rooted on the idea of equity in terms of my experience as someone with a disability to access services or products should be without barriers, or it should be the same as those who have no disability. So the idea of accessibility really is to drive equity in terms of access to all experiences for those with disabilities, and being able to create an environment where there is no discrimination or devaluing of those with disabilities with the products and services that we offer. And I think when you start looking at this, then you can look at a company through different lenses and try to think of accessibility as ways to ensure that this company and its products and services can be accessed equally by those with disabilities and those without. Now, give an example, because we are increasingly building a digital world. So every company will use digital tools to interact or communicate or even present what they have to offer to the world. So take the example of a website, right? Every company now wants to go online or is online already, actually. And you have a website, which is the easiest way for everybody to find you online. But when it comes to web design, unfortunately, majority of websites that we have on the internet today are not accessible. They were not designed with the idea that this website is for everyone. And most companies kind of either skip that step or want to apply a temporary solution. So I think, the idea of accessibility needs also to be understood within the aspect of universal design, or the idea that accessibility does not just benefit persons with disabilities. Yes, it does enable persons with disabilities to get access, but in most cases, it's been shown that user experience is improved for everyone. For businesses that take accessibility seriously, this does have an effect on the brand and on even the bottom line of the company, because you are not locking out anybody, and you're not making assumptions that you would never have a person with disability looking out to buy my product. So I think it's this idea that we need to continuously eliminate barriers into everything that we design and build, and that we are not designing only for persons with disabilities. We are designing for everyone, and the whole idea is, can humanity have an equitable experience when it comes to the interactions that we create and the worlds that we build, both physically and virtually.
Thank you so much for this answer. It's actually very interesting how we're kind of building this new world online, right? But if we are not mindful of equity and accessibility, we will recreate the same oppressive systems once again. So it's so important to be mindful of these concepts and have these conversations and include actively people from the most marginalized backgrounds, people with different identities in the design of these new solutions. So thank you so much, Bernard, for your answer. Chisom has already kind of touched upon the topic of disability language and etiquette, but I have a question for Kaisa here. So if we talk about disability language and etiquette, some might argue that in some way inclusive communication makes people afraid of speaking freely because they don't want to get canceled or say the wrong thing. What can companies do to bridge the gap to ensure that employees mitigate the use of ableist language whilst ensuring an open and inclusive culture for learning and unlearning?
I think to some extent, a lot of us have learned a second language. English is not my first language. I had to learn it. So same goes for quite a lot of us who are not from English-speaking countries. We have learned a second language. That's how we operate in the world. Which means that with awareness and empathy, you should be able to sort of figure out what is okay and what is not. And that goes for your own language as well. It doesn't really work if you know that in English you shouldn't call anybody lame, but it's totally okay to do the same thing in Norwegian if that's your natural language. That doesn't work out. But I think to create awareness of why this is hurtful to use that kind of language, and really to make people reflect for their empathy about sort of, why is this a problematic phrase to use? Why is this a problematic thing? I think that's the way to go, because you kind of have to, well, to some extent, it seems like you have to explain to people why it's a problem that you say that you use these things. And then on the other hand, the backlash of getting it wrong can sometimes, it seems that it sometimes can be a little bit more severe, because it may have come from a place of, you know, unawareness. And to me, it's like, if you back up and go like, oh, I will try to do better next time, assuming that you don't do it over again in different contexts. You know, if you see a pattern of this person going like, oh, I didn't know that was a bad thing to say, I'm so lame, at some point, that, you know, that joke is a little bit, it will fall flat. But I think having the sort of the environment where you can create awareness, and then if you are corrected, you are being corrected in an empathic way, which means it's easier to go, oh, I can see why this is hurtful. I will do my best to not say this again. I think that's hopefully a way to go, but to some extent, because of the sort of the whole ableism thing, we may need to just bring it up, that this I think with a little bit of consciousness, a little bit of, you know, being more aware of the world around you, you can find new ways of saying the same things. You don't have to go about and use the same terms. You just need to learn new terms, because, you know, language change and perspectives change. And then at some point, you know, if you still can't really stop using sensitive words, your manager or somebody needs to take you, maybe have a conversation and really sort of drive through, are you not catching on to the impact, this negative impact this language makes for you, and could you please be, at least pretend that you're a decent human being and stop using those words. So
Something to add?
Yes, thanks, Kansia, for that. I wanted to add actually that it's also perhaps useful to normalize that making mistakes a part of the process, because I think that oftentimes, especially when it comes to inclusion efforts or equity efforts, there's a lot of shame attached to it. So it's like, oh, if you make a mistake, you're canceled, you know. And I think we really need to practice grace. And I think that, you know, if you're just getting acquainted with words that are ableist and you're trying to unlearn them, you've had 30, 40, 50 years of using a word, right? And, you know, to automatically be expected to drop that language immediately after a first session, for example, is a bit unrealistic. But what can be done, though, is learning this word. So the next time you use it, you know, you're like, oh, that was ableist. Need to correct myself. I've been doing this work now for over 14 years, and I still find myself every now and then using a word that is ableist. The difference, though, is I know, like, the minute it's coming out of my mouth, I'm regretting it, because I know, like, it's not a word I should use, and I correct myself immediately and I use the right word, you know. So I think that is also a part of the process, because there are some things that we say that we do not even realize that are ableist. For example, up until a couple of months ago, I still talked about blind recruitment as, you know, like one of the ways to standardize, you know, recruitment processes. So I think it's just important that we have grace for ourselves and that we remove the shame. And the thing is that the more we practice, the more we train our brain, the more we get better at not using this language and correcting ourselves even before we say them.
Thank you so much for adding that, Chisholm. Maybe some of you have noticed a few days ago, Diversify posted a small infographics on disability language. You can find it on our LinkedIn profile and probably also Facebook. So there are some useful tips on how to, you know, which language is actually ableist and which words are better to be used. But let's jump into our next question. It's again some of the terms and topics we have already touched upon, but we can still dig deeper. So Chisom, this next question is for you. Coming back to accessibility, Bernard also already mentioned the topic of universal design. And some people argue, though, that the universal design is problematic because it has been built on Western colonialist white and normative standards of what is universal. Do you agree? And what can be done to mitigate this?
I guess this is an easy question or like short one. Yes, in many cases, it has been designed within this frame. And to mitigate it, we need to remove this frame through which we design processes. And we need to include the leadership and the design of the people for whom this products the universal accessible products are built for. I think one of the ways to think about it is, of course, we cannot include every person with disability or every person with neurodiversity or whatnot in a design process, but we can definitely do a lot to reduce exclusion as much as possible. And it just comes in, do we think about who might potentially use, you know, this product? And if we're not thinking about the ideal customer for it, but we're thinking about everybody, even those we can think of currently, and those we're not even thinking about, how can we make it accessible? And how do we bring in new perspectives, right? And include the people for whom it is for in the design and the creation of it.
When you say that we should step away from the set frame that we are operating with at the moment, do you mean we should come up with something totally different, or we should just kind of reshape it?
Well, so this is a abolitionist versus reformist conversation. And I think a lot of reformist strategies don't work because they fit within already established systems that are oppressive. It is possible that we can reform something and just like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and see what we need to do here. But if we're reforming within a set structure, that is problematic. But if we say, for example, okay, we're trying to do something new, and especially when it comes to accessibility, there's a lot that is still very new, right? So instead of fitting it within this normative ableist construct, we can go, okay, we want to do something, let's do a design thinking process. Let's get the right people in a room and start designing what this could potentially look like. We're not telling people, hey, here's a definition, here's a framework, design within this framework. We're just like, hey, go, you know, like, just do what you want. Show me what you, just imagine like having a bunch of kids in a room and saying like, create something and let's see what that looks like and how accessible it is. And I think that's where creativity and innovation kind of like spreads its wing, where people will not, like, if I tell you, Susanna, think about this, but think about it like this, you're going to already automatically think about it within the frame that I have given you. But if I come to you and I say, we have a problem, or we need to create a new product that addresses this problem, come up with whatever you may. That is a different situation. And in terms of the creativity that spawns out of that would be probably like more impactful than within the frame already given to you.
Thank you so much. Bernard, I saw that you raised your hand. Do you want to add anything to it?
Yeah, I just wanted to like jump in there and say, okay, I think the idea of universal design should be understood from the perspective of including everyone. And so I would move from, say, universal design and say inclusive design or inclusive innovation, because I mean, rarely when when we're designing products or services, or new offerings, I think the question is, at that very point, when there is no representation of persons with disabilities, I think you tend to create, an outcome that is not very inclusive. So I think it's these ideas: how can we co-create, co-innovate with those with disabilities, and realizing that it is important that this is done at the earliest stage, because then you do not want to start reverse engineering for inclusion. I think you need to do it. The best way to do it, the most appropriate way to do it is from the beginning. But realistically, what's happening in the world today is that most people are at a point where they never did it, so they have to reverse engineer and start thinking about it, and it's more expensive, it's more inconvenient. So I think it's so important that this kind of inclusive design or inclusive innovation is incorporated from the very beginning and not at the end.
I could just add to that as well. I think like sometimes companies especially, they think, we're small now, when we're big enough, we will start. I think going to what Bernard is saying is the foundation where you build your house matters. Absolutely. Like imagine building a house and the foundation is a bit shaky. And then you have this tall building and you're thinking, okay, how do we, reinforce this foundation? It's just better to do it right from the start.
Thank you so much, Chisholm. I see Kaisa also wants to add something to this topic, please.
Yeah, and that's the tech thing, and some companies are really embracing it, and much to the surprise sometimes of more abled people. And earlier today we had a session about AI and generative AI and ChatGPT, and some of the innovations around that. And my colleague who had the presentation for us, he was talking about like the 3 ways of doing this specific thing, and one of them was by speaking, and he was like, it felt very clunky. And it was like it took him more time to speak to the machine than to type to the machine. It was like, why on earth they did do this? And then suddenly he had an epiphany and goes like, oh, it means that people who can't type can actually use this technology, and they've sort of built it from scratch. They've built it from the start. It was like, wow, that's super good. And I'm like, yes, that is good. And thank you for, sharing your realization that this, is an important thing. So some companies, as I said, they are driving accessibility, at least in the technical sense, even including for, the back end, not just the products that you're using, but also how you can be part of building the new world.
Thank you so much for adding that, Kaisa, and thank you, Bernard, for bringing also in the concept of inclusive design, because yes, there's a difference between universal and inclusive design. They are interconnected, but as you mentioned, inclusive design is actually very thoughtful of including the leadership and active participation of those for whom the projects, initiatives are meant to serve. So thank you for bringing that up. And I actually have a question for you, since we are already talking about the tech and you are the tech superstar here on this panel. You are the director of Innovate Now, which is Africa's first assistive technology accelerator. How would you define inclusive tech to our audience? Could you mention some of the latest groundbreaking innovations in inclusive tech that are expected to be a game changer in the future? So there's like 2 questions in one.
Yeah, so thank you. All right, so I think when it comes to technology and disability, you can't talk about those two without talking about assistive technology. And this is kind of the background that I work in. And when we started Innovate Now, the whole idea was what's the significance or the importance of assistive technology, and what is the state? What is the state? So unfortunately, there's actually a very big disparity today between access to assistive technology depending on where you live or where you were born. So most people in Africa and developing countries do not access assistive technology as easily as it would be for someone living in a developed country. And so when we began this work, the whole idea was, okay, how might we bridge this gap, and how might we create or increase access to assistive technology? Now, when it comes to assistive tech, it's I think it sits at a very primal or a significant place for a person with disability, because even when you create accessibility and the person with disability is not empowered to participate, they would still not be able to get access. So it's very kind of primary. So today the situation is such that only 1 in 10 people that need assistive technologies have access in most of the developing world. And there's kind of a trend that by the year 2050, the global gap of access to AT will increase to 3.5 billion people from today's 2.5 billion by the latest research. So the way we view this then is that we have no choice. We have to accelerate this access. And so Innovate now kind of say, okay, there's many ways this is being done at different levels. There's policy work to kind of advance this from a human rights perspective and government's responsibility. But we all know when you look out through history that a lot of the benefits and products that humanity enjoys today, it took an entrepreneur to solve a problem. And for a very long time, entrepreneurs were not active in the space of disability, especially in Africa, where I come from. So Innovate now kind of became a platform to provide or encourage innovation in this space to lower this barrier of access. And some of the main things we target are, what's the cost of assistive technologies in this space? It's very high. So we're trying to reduce that. And also trying to improve ease of accessibility. So I'm going to give quick examples that kind of touch on this idea of cost and increasing access and things like that. Now, one of the biggest situations we have in developing countries is that mobility is very difficult for persons with disabilities. And that's because, of course, the built environment is largely not accessible. And the transport system, the public transport system, is equally and not very accessible. So one of the entrepreneurs we spotted through our first cohort, he built a company called Cell Technology that aimed at giving wheelchair users more, power or a possibility for them to experience outdoor distances with less difficulty, given that public transport is not accessible for wheelchair users. So they built an electric tricycle targeted at wheelchair users to cover like short distances that will still be very difficult for someone with disability to move on their own on a manual wheelchair. And while this innovation was not like anything new per se, because electric chairs have been there for a long time, or tricycles. However, in this part of the world, persons with disabilities have not been at the forefront of electric mobility. And this was one of the first companies to give that to them. And to kind of just say that we can't just assume that electric mobility doesn't work in Africa, because this again has been until now when it's really getting hot. So this company basically is just making it possible for people to move, and I love that they're doing it in a very clean way, because they're using electric mobility. I'll give another example, and this is kind of interesting in the sense that most of the time when you think about electoral justice, or do people with disabilities actually participate in the electoral process, for example? So there's this company that during COVID, they built an application to help deaf people access sign language on demand on their phone. And this problem was, COVID helped them realize how big this was, because during COVID, people were wearing masks and there was limitation of movement. So deaf people really had it rough. So they just realized, why not use the power of a smartphone and just have sign language available to people. And last year in our general election in Kenya, this application was used to assist persons who are deaf to go through the electoral process. And I think it's innovations like this that they kind of respond to the need and the context, but at the same time they give us this idea that inclusive tech or assistive technology is really a game changer when you think about some of the barriers and how you can eliminate them, especially if you're in the developing world, where we don't want to recreate everything that the West has created, but we want to create new ways that overcome or even leapfrog the traditional approaches. And I think this is what Innovate Now is enabling for people to rethink and innovate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Bernard. I think we will all check out these startups after this session. My next question will be for Kaisa. We have just for the panelists, we have 23 minutes left of this panel discussion part, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A with the audience. So please, audience, feel free to ask questions. We are here for you. So Kaisa, my next question is for you. What is internalized ableism? And can you state some examples of how people with disabilities experience internalized ableism and how to cope with it? And maybe Chisholm and Bernard can add here if they want to later.
So for me, this is like what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be healthy. You're supposed to be like functioning. You're supposed to not be different. And if you are, you are not going to talk about it. You're not going to sort of express that. That's what my thought on internalized ableism is, which is problematic because the whole so when I grew up, my arthritis sounds horribly boring, but as a kid, having arthritis is not so fun. Not for anybody really, but it's like it's a little bit hard to understand what this is. It means that my joints are swelling. It hurts. I have had fevers. And basically spent a lot of time and energy covering these things because you were not supposed to make, why would you want to be different? Why did you want to be like less? I think that's probably the thing. Like, at least in Norwegian society, if you're not healthy, that's a problem. And you don't really want to be that problem. You want to cope, you want to do the same thing as everybody else can, but you can't really. And always striving to be like the other ones, even if you're at a disadvantage from the start. That is a thing. And then you kind of switch into, well, I am a survivor. I will of course conquer the world, even if I have a disability. So I will now go into sort of overdrive, which is, as I mentioned, I did not really speak about my disability because I could usually manage. I can manage because I am that kind of person. Sounds horrible, but I come from a background where, you know, I could be that person. I could have the resources to actually do well, even if that meant I had absolutely no energy at the end of the day. My pain threshold is fairly high, which means that I can function under really bad circumstances, but I will do it because I will not want to be less, you know. And then my journey into, you know, speaking openly about this is the whole role model thing. And seeing that other people, particularly the ones who kind of came into the same situation as me, but as teenagers or young adults or adults in itself, that you suddenly have this sort of, suddenly you have a disease, suddenly you have a sickness that actually affects you, and you think that everybody around you is normal, and they are all perfect and they're all functioning, and you feel weird, you know. Having that change, and then I started talking about how I struggle sometimes, what I actually do, and some of it is to be also ashamed of being sick or whatever, which is like completely bonkers to be honest, but that's kind of how it was and how it is. And I've had some feedback from my colleagues who were like, this helped me a lot, you know, because they have suddenly experienced this as adults and trying to sort of shift away a little bit and realizing that, well, you can still actually be you can still contribute even if you have this thing, but you may need to have some adjustments. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal journey.
Thanks a lot for sharing. I'm just thinking about like how this relates, or like how I interact with this. I think being neurodiverse and also having a disability. So I have ADHD and I also have an anxiety disorder. And I think especially, and this is not, Africans are not a monolith, and I'm just speaking from my personal experience where, you know, if you go through things like depression, which I sometimes do, or have anxiety, there is a stigma attached to it and a shame attached to it. I remember when I was a bit younger, you know, like when I first had my proper bouts of depression, you know, having a chat with my mother, you know, because depression is not something we talk about, like disability, mental health, it's not something we really talk about, at least at the time. And telling my mother, hey, I'm depressed and I need help. I need to get, you know, a therapist. And, you know, her first reaction was, but why are you depressed? You have everything you need. I mean, you have a house, you have water, you have food, you're going to a great school, you have money, you know, like what is there to be depressed about? Life is good. And of course, like she's not there anymore. She's at a point where like go see a therapist, so yay. But, you know, like that was my initial experience with the shame and the stigma, you know, that comes with having, you know, challenges with disability or mental health or neurodiversity. So I think for me, it was also to normalize and take the power back from that shame that I had passively accepted as you know, being able to vocalize my condition and not seeing it as something that limits me, seeing it actually as something that makes me stronger, makes me a better leader, makes me more vulnerable and honest. And so for me, I don't see my disability or my neurodiversity as a, you know, hindrance or a limiting factor. I see it as, you know, the different intersectional identities that I have. And it makes me cool and quirky and a bit weird, and that's perfectly okay. So I think for me, I had to just reframe what those things or these things mean to me and accept it as a part of my identity, but also learn how to manage and how to manage and cope with it, recognizing that when do I get anxiety? You know, what happens in my life around the time when I feel depressed? You know, so I think just thinking about how do I modulate, how do I take care of myself in terms of self-care, how do I draw boundaries, you know, in terms of work, in terms of personal relationships and the things that are inherently triggers, but definitely just removing every type of shame, because I don't want to uphold those ableist systems and structures for myself.
Thank you for adding that, Chisom. So we have 15 minutes left. So I would ask our panelists to keep their answers crisp. So my next question will be to Chisom. Why is an intersectional lens important with regards to our experiences of disability, neurodiversity, and ableism? And can you maybe link it to the workplace? Why is intersectionality important within the workplace setting?
Yeah, I think we've all kind of touched on this throughout this conversation. I think it's important because that way we can use an equity lens in creating solutions and designing for people within a workplace perspective. So I think, at least if you ask me, I think that's why it is important to recognize that we're not all the same. And I think on equality, one thing that is really important is we're all equal in value, but we don't have equal situations. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? So if we acknowledge this and then focus our efforts on equity, then intersectionality is really important to say, okay, how do we ensure that we're not treating Bernard and Kaiser the same, or Kaiser and Chisom the same? How do we ensure that they all feel included in, you know, what we have created or the initiatives we've put forward?
Thank you. I think that was an example of a crisp answer. Bernard, I'm coming to you. How does ableism affect neurodivergent people in the workplace, but also society at large? Sorry, Bernard,
we can hear you.
We are struggling to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was saying that I think the most pressing issue when it comes to neurodivergent people and ableism is the fact that as a disability, it's not visible. Okay, so a lot of the time, people with any, you know, with autism and other conditions, people will treat you, you know, the interaction before, if they actually get to know that you have a neurodivergent, you know, impairment or condition, the discrimination or the impact of the discrimination or the aspect of making people feel devalued is really high for people with neurodivergent disabilities, because the disability is not obvious, and most of the time it's discovered in an awkward way through an interaction where you start thinking, you know, why is this person behaving like this, or, you know, why was that so weird, and things like that. And it's also not very easy to have a lot of the time, as Chisom mentioned, because of the stigma around you know, neurodivergent people and conditions, you know, it's not always easy to talk about these disabilities, even when you have a perfectly, say, seemingly safe environment. People don't just come out as obviously as people with other forms of disabilities, where it's very obvious, and people can maybe take cue from already seeing me. They know how, okay, this is how I'm gonna start approaching Bernard, because obviously he has a disability. So I think this idea that we need to be more conscious that people are more than what they seem, and you can't judge a person just by the physical appearance, or, you know, you kind of have to, my take on this will be, I think I would appreciate the idea of treating every individual with the thinking in mind that they do have or might have an invisible disability. Because when you're meeting people for the first time, you don't have, the luxury of knowing, right? So I think it calls on to this idea that as human beings, we need more empathy and more consciousness in the way we treat other human beings, even when we are limited in terms of knowledge of other people and how they might be. And I think, when people actually reveal that they have a disability that is invisible, that, again, should not be an opportunity to like just treat them weirdly, or I mean, it might come out as a surprise, but I think we need to really learn about how to deal with this type of information without necessarily promoting ableism or discrimination. And as I mentioned when I began, when we start looking at these things as human issues, we bring them down to a level of, it's something that anybody could experience, and that you want to make that person feel valued, and you don't want to make them feel discriminated. And while this is not the, I guess most of the time, this is not the approach that everyone will take, because we all have different personalities and the way we act. So I think for me, what I would call for is for everyone to just make an effort to be more conscious, and to treat people with respect and with love. Because when I hear these topics more and more often, I think they reinforce for me the idea of humanity, and that it is possible to treat people with respect and love. And when it comes to people with disabilities, the way you do that is by being inclusive in your interaction, in your communication, and being empathetic. I think that's the word. I feel like this skill of empathy, is one of those skills that is going to continue to be extremely important for humanity. I think in the age of technology and AI, one of those things that will not be replaced by AI for sure is empathy, because it's a very human thing and a very human skill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. You have stated some very important takeaways from this session for all of us. So I hope people are writing that down. But Kaisa, do you want to add something?
Yeah, very very concrete in the whole neurodivergent people in the workplace is like and society at large. How much text do we write? How crisp and clear are we in our communication? That could, if instead of having a long rambling email, if you are short and to the point, that would benefit both probably people with dyslexia and also some people with ADHD. And I've seen us out and about in training courses, not and you get handed like a three-page document, and the trainer go like, well, just have a skim through this and we will discuss it in 5 minutes. A lot of people will be able to actually skim through, but I've been in situations where I've been paired up with somebody who was not able to do that at all, and I felt really, really bad for this person, because I don't know, we didn't speak about it, but it's like, is this too many words for you, particularly in this short time? And how can we, me as a fellow participant, how can I sort of make this less awkward? That was probably one of my first experiences with meeting people with dyslexia in outside of school, you know, and that is a reality. And I think that maybe some of my other colleagues would not be very happy if I gave them like, could you just skim through this thing and we'll talk about it in 5 minutes. No. And being mindful of those, you know, that is an issue. Giving people time and also maybe not just asking people to just come up with something like that would probably be a benefit for everybody.
So recognizing that we are not the norm when we are designing these processes, structures, or even projects, workshops. Chisholm, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you want to add something?
Yes, I think you took the words out of my mouth in terms of like, well, not the norm. But I guess one way to nuance this is that even for people with disabilities, and in terms of also sometimes how we uphold ableist structures, is we have stereotypes of how people with disabilities present. So for example, we have stereotypes of, for many of us, or maybe, no, let me not speak for everyone, but for people who have ADHD or ADD, for example, like the first impression that somebody might get is that they literally bounce off the walls, right? And this is also a stereotype in terms of like how people with ADHD or people with ADD interact with the world around them, how they like to work, because there are different layers and different ways in which people present and in which people like in different ways in which people take in information, you know. So I think even those stereotypes are incredibly dangerous. So for people with disabilities, people with neurodiversity, recognizing that because you have ADHD and I have ADHD doesn't mean we're going to, you know, like interact with this world and with our neurodiversity in the same way. And of course, for people who are neurotypical, recognizing that we're not the norm, none of us at the norm. And I think in recognizing that we're not the norm, then maybe we can approach the world, people, solutions, initiatives with a little bit more grace and awareness, as opposed to centering ourselves and our experiences as the norm and everything else as abnormal.
Thank you so much for adding that, Chisholm. We have 3 minutes left and the last question is ahead of us. So I think I can give 1 minute to each of you. And it will be short and sweet. Can you give us your best tip on how to tackle ableism in the workplace? One tip that you think is the best way to tackle ableism. Who wants to go first? Bernard.
Yes, I'll go first. And I'm not sure whether this is the best tip, but I think, I think when you look at the root cause of ableism, it's biases. It's not having the same understanding or the same information or the correct information. It's not knowing, or sometimes, of course, it can come from a point of, straight, bad culture. So I think one of the best ways to build this culture of inclusion within an organization is to intentionally, as an organization, decide and make it clear that you're going to make a continuous effort to create an equitable work environment, an inclusive work environment. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that this conversation is continuously happening in terms of creating awareness. And it's not a one-off conversation that happens in a workshop once a year or once a quarter. I think people need to interact more with the idea of inclusion. And it doesn't have to be a webinar, but I think we have to create ways in the everyday work for people to experience inclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Kaisa, I saw that you also unmuted yourself at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, so +1 on everything Bernard said, but also to call it out. And as empathetic way you can do it. For me, that's often, if it happens in the group, you don't necessarily call it out in the group unless it's like incredibly disrespectful. We've had some discussions on this internally, but at the end of the day, is like making people aware first, and then when you know that you have made them aware previously and they're still continuing, then it's easier to just pause a little bit in the conversation if there's several people, but don't necessarily speak up for other people. That's the most horrible experience. If somebody sort of protects you by going, I know that Kaisa has difficulties of walking, so maybe we should, do this thing instead. And then you're like, I can probably walk the distance that this person tried to. But I think creating awareness, and also, but for people to call it out, to reinforce that awareness. Even if you did the training, you may be reminded.
But if I can just build on that, I think call it out, absolutely agree. If you can, right there when it happens, but it's also okay to call it out afterwards, because I'm just mindful of the fact that sometimes, we can be in situations where something happens and you're so shocked, you're not even sure what to say, how to say, and depending on the power balance, what to do about it. So I think we also have to leave grace for that, but absolutely see something, say something. I think that's important. And just, I think for me, so I completely agree with what both Berna and Kaisa have said. I think I would just add, create an environment of learning and unlearning, where people feel safe to make mistakes, where people feel safe to be corrected or do the correction without facing repercussions from, oh my gosh, how dare you correct me? I'm the CEO of this company, right? And remove the shame from making mistakes. Like, if we're here to learn and we're here to unlearn, that is how we can actually create a good and inclusive culture in our workplace.
Thank you so much, Chisholm. Thank you, Kaisa. Thank you, Bernard. We have gone through the 90 minutes of our prepared panel discussion, and now the stage is open for our audience. So while we have been talking, some questions have already popped up in the chat. So I have skimmed through it, and I can see a question from Marcella. It's not targeted to any of the panelists, so just feel free to answer if you feel like you'd like to say something about it. So the question is, how do you guide companies regarding balancing making the workplace environment inclusive from the get-go versus accepting accommodation needs might arise, which does add an extra load to the disabled employee? Kaisa's hand is up.
Because this is something we talk about. So being aware of the different types of accommodations that may be required would be a good start, so that whenever somebody asks, well, do you have anything that can sort of help out with this thing, HR or whoever is in charge of those, or the starting point for those discussions, have made some, have thought about it. So that you don't have to always react and try to figure it out once it's there. It's more about being 2 steps ahead and thinking that maybe this assistive tech would help. How are we on these things? And to be honest, maybe have thought about, well, these things we can't really handle. Our company is doing doing something, and if that is like totally the opposite of what you can be expected to do, well, can we work together at all? Maybe to actually be a little bit more open on those things early. But rather, I would want us to sort of have ideas about what can be done for a certain amount of issues, and then when you're good at being coming up with ideas and coming up with solutions. Then you have a sort of library of things, and then maybe it's easier when you get the 11th thing. It's like, but that's kind of a variety of thing number 2 and 3. Let's see if we can sort of make this work.
I could add to that as well. I think, of course, so the question on making it inclusive from the get-go, I think we've nuanced that, and Bernard had also a good answer there, you know, around like, you know, we do it from the start and having a good foundation. And I think to accepting accommodation needs that arise, one of the ways we have to think about it is so for people, as disability is something that we can acquire throughout our lives multiple times, you know, that maybe we're not able to anticipate everything that happens ahead of time. So if, so for example, somebody gets cancer, it is a form of disability depending on how it affects them, right? And then the organization has a responsibility to think, what can we do to make this person's life a lot easier? Even if it comes down to like flexible work, where they work, how they work, where they show up, like giving them times in terms of when they get their treatment. So I think there's some things we can't anticipate, but we can always have accommodations. And it's also we need to be mindful about the disclosure effect, where people should not need to feel the responsibility in their workplace to disclose their disabilities or their conditions, right? So maybe another way to navigate this path, especially for disability that comes on across our life, is to also have accessibility surveys that could be anonymous. So people can, you know, make suggestions if they feel like they need it without having to say like, okay, I need to fully disclose what this is. But always on companies, it's important to recognize that the onus and the responsibility should not be on the individual in the workplace, the employee, to disclose or tell you what they need. I think the responsibility should be on leadership in terms of thinking about, you know, what I think Brenna and Kaiser also said around inclusive accessibility, inclusive design, in creating systems and structures that are beneficial to all people, regardless of if they have their disability now or if it's something that comes on later.
Thank you so much, both Chisholm and Kaisa, for these useful tips. Bernard, I have just noticed that you have added links for the startups or the assistive tech that you mentioned. Thank you so much for doing that. I will definitely check it out. So we have a question here from Mila. Is it ableist to correct spelling mistakes of a colleague with dyslexia? Might sound like a simple question, but is it? Who would like to answer?
Do you know they have dyslexia?
That's the question, right? Well, what if you know? What if you don't know?
Yeah, I think I will attempt the answer, and I would say that, I mean, obviously, correcting it is not wrong, because, you know, it needs to be grammatically correct. I think it's more on the approach and how you do it, and also the fact that, I mean, if you know this individual person has a dyslexia, and even when you don't, I think it's just a matter of trying to understand, you know, for example, has this been a trend that everything they submit seems to be having spelling mistakes, and then you're like, what's up with that? I think it's not wrong to correct. I think what's wrong is to do it in a way that would make that person feel discriminated or devalued. And I think it's not any different from treating people with respect. You know, it's just like one of that situation of just trying to treat people in the right way. So it's not wrong, but I think it needs to be done right, and that needs to take into consideration the context, which, yeah, that's my best attempt at that.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Chisholm, do you want to add to it? I see you have unmuted.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I agree with Bernard, I think we should also be careful not to make assumptions Because if somebody has a lot of mistakes, for example, in what they write up, to say, oh, they must be dyslexic, because maybe they're not, maybe the language they're writing in is not their first language, and then they make a lot of mistakes in writing. So it's something we need to be mindful of. But I think we can always ask people questions, you know, like, would you mind? Are you okay with me correcting you? You know, and I do completely agree with Bernard in terms of, you know, it's the approach that matters. And there's always this thing about, like, instead of make assumption, just ask, like, can I correct you, or can I ask? You know, it goes a long way than to just, like, you know, because sometimes correcting them can also come off as either passively aggressive or actively aggressive, depending on how it's done. So yes, just wanted to add that.
Thank you both. Another question that we have comes from a tech industry perspective. Marcella has asked, what do you think are realistic or fair expectations one can have on employers in terms of inclusivity and belonging in 2023? Kaisa, I think yeah.
To me, it's like you can expect them to have ideas about this and being clear. If they are not, that's a red flag. You know, in 2023, if you come to a company and they can't really say anything about what they're doing about inclusion and belonging, I would be surprised, because it's like, it's all over. And there are other employers who definitely has some ideas about this. And that, you know, that's a realistic piece. How far they have come, I think that definitely depends on a lot of things. As I said, I also represent the tech industry, and I know that there's a wide variety. Some people, you know, may have heard about the thing and may have started thinking about it, while others are like, it's a core business value. But having a human center from the leadership to all the mid-levels and to the people who are doing the actual coding or work or technology thing, I would kind of expect at least the more mature companies, regardless of size, that they have some ideas about this, and that's what I would have expectation on. Not saying it's true, not saying that it does happen.
I think it's also asking, does that company claim to be inclusive and, you know, like create a space that, you know, people belong in? I think, I mean, it's not saying that if they don't claim it, then they have a free pass to not create, you know, inclusive systems. But I think, especially for companies that claim that they do, and you see that they don't, there's almost, I don't know what Kaisa feels about this, but I feel like there's no excuse, you know, to not be ahead of the curve, or not at least being at par with where your other industry players are. What do you think, Kaisa?
No, I think you're right, and I think that there are so many companies who are at least on the journey here, that if you will usually there's always a need for people in the tech industry. So it's like, if you are in a place where inclusivity and belonging is just laughed at, you will have other opportunities other places. You don't have to stay, I think.
Thank you both for answering this question. I hope Marcella will be able to access it, because I think I might have seen that she logged off. So hope she will see the recording.
She's still here.
Oh, she's still here. Okay, then it wasn't Marcella. I have almost missed the question from Miguel, who was also commenting on something that we discussed at that point, because Miguel said, I agree. It's difficult to include absolutely everyone, and it's challenging to include people from who we do not know what they need. However, what is the line between disclosure and inclusion? Should employees have to disclose their disabilities or neurodivergence with employees? I think, Chisom, you touched upon this topic, but do you want to answer this, or anyone else?
Maybe somebody else.
I can restate. Should employees, what's the line between disclosure and inclusion? Should employees have to disclose their disabilities or neurodivergence with employers?
So I think to some extent it may make sense, if particularly if you see that there's no natural way of getting those accommodations without actually talking about it openly. You know, you kind of have to at least mention it, at least be open about it. I have a couple of neurodivergent colleagues who are like, well, I'm open about these things because it makes it easier for me to work in the group. You know, if and you may not need to say I have this thing. It's more like I am unable to prioritize 5 tasks. My brain just don't. Please help me out. You know, being open about it. You don't have to tell about why you can't prioritize, but you need help in order to be efficient. So I think you may not need to give like all the details. Similarly, like I don't have to give all the details on why I tried this, but sometimes I would need to say, I can't really do this, or I need to have a special chair, because then I can be effective and not, you know, hurt by 1 o'clock. I don't have to go into all the details.
Thank you for your answer, Kaisa. So the next question we have here.
Sorry, did Bernard want to say something? I think.
Sorry.
Thanks, Chisom, for reading my mind. So I feel like this idea about disclosure, you know, to disclose or not to disclose, is really an aspect that already tells you that that particular workplace, I mean, if this is in question, then it means that that particular workplace hasn't really found a way to make employees or people feel included, and maybe it's something that they're trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. And I think just going back to the definitions we talked about in the beginning, I feel like if you make it more or less about the person and more about the barriers to get things done, you might make disclosure more inclusive, in the sense that you don't have to tell someone to, okay, do you have A, B, C, D? You could ask, you know, would this, I mean, you could try and understand what are the barriers in the workplace for people with different disabilities, and make sure that all employees have an opportunity to give feedback or to say something about the work environment and what can be what can be done to make the work environment more enabling. So I feel like disclosure doesn't have to feel like, you know, I'm going to talk about this thing that I have and let everyone know that I have it. It should be more of like, you know, about the work environment and productivity, and making suggestions about how you as an employee can be more productive or can be more equipped, you know, and being given an opportunity to say, these are the things that don't work or work well in the workplace. Thank you.
Susanna, if I can just quickly add to what both have said, I think from a workplace perspective, in terms of disclosure, I tend to think that people should not have to disclose if they don't want to. And mainly that's around like psychological safety, because sometimes depending on the culture of the workplace, if you disclose or disclose partly, but not all, maybe that manager just unconsciously stops giving you work, you know, or maybe it's maybe sometimes from your previous experience, disclosure has not been beneficial. And for people, disclosure, depending on the extent of, you know, say the traumas that they carry or the experiences that they have, could be a limiting factor. So I think coming back to thinking continuously, how can we make the workplace accessible, and could we use anonymous surveys to collect information, especially, you know, when you want to continuously create workplaces that are inclusive for all. I think disclosure, if you have a safe environment, is absolutely wonderful and sometimes necessary, but also just removing that onus again on the person with the disability, that they have to disclose their disability in order to get the resources that they need. So I find it a bit tricky to say a firm yes or no. It's difficult.
Thank you very much for this important input on this question. We do have a question here from Shayantani. And the question is for all. So again, whoever feels like answering this, please, you are welcome. The question is, when describing people with disabilities, is identity or person first language preferred?
I think it depends on the person. We can always ask them what they prefer. Because there's a whole conversation about, like, for example, people with disabilities or a disabled person. And there are some people who prefer to say, I am a disabled person. And there are some people who prefer to say, I am a person with disability. And then there is this whole thing, oftentimes by people who are not disabled or people with disabilities, saying, I don't think saying disabled person is inclusive or the right way to address this person. We should instead say, you know, person with disability, or I am an autistic person, or I am a person with autism. You know, I think just ask people how they want to be addressed. There's that whole thing about agency. And I think agency matters a lot in any type of inclusion effort. It's agency in terms of, even when we're using pronouns, you know, the fact that somebody presents as a woman does not necessarily mean that their pronouns are she, her. So ask them, how do you want to be addressed? And and follow their agency. That would be my thing.
Thank you so much for answering, Chisholm. I guess as you have mentioned previously, the cancel culture has gotten to all of us, and we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. So we then don't know what is wrong or right anymore in some instances. But as you said, the best way is to ask. So Eva has asked a question: are workplace accommodations a way to fight ableism? And maybe I could then elaborate on that and ask, or is ableism something broader than just work accommodations, than just accommodations in a workplace?
My take on that is no. Workplace accommodations is a way to make people, you know, function in doing what they want to do, which is probably their job at the workplace. Is like making sure that they are able to do that. I wouldn't automatically say it's a way to fight ableism. That totally depends on what kind of accommodations you are asking, and if it's like the only thing that you did. Because if you basically, you know, I write better on a certain type of keyboard. If I get that, but nothing else changes, we are not fighting ableism. We are just handing out a tool that makes me being more efficient and not hurt. You know, fighting ableism is having these kinds of conversations, talking about it. Maybe asking ourselves, is typing 8 hours a day really the best approach for anybody in this business? You know, so I think it's not. It could be part of it, but it's definitely. It's not necessarily a connection there for me.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer. Anybody wants to add, or can we move on to the next question? Okay, nobody's unmuting. Well, next question we got is from a participant on LinkedIn, Paulina, who asked, what are the resources that I can use to learn more about ableism in general and specifically about neurotypicality in the workplace? I am a trainer and those topics interest me from both perspectives, learner and trainer, as she's an instructional designer. So where can we find good resources to learn more about ableism and specifically about neurodiversity?
My first thinking is always like Google is your friend, but there is a document that was recently released by, I forget the nonprofit organization. If anyone on my team remembers what I'm talking about, Miguel, I think you shared this. So if you recall what Oxfam, yes, there you go. There's a document, I don't know if you can link it here, Miguel, as well, that was created by Oxfam that is absolutely great in terms of like even things like ableist language, how to create more inclusive workplaces. I think that's a good one. At Diversify, we also have some resources. So if you connect with us, send us a message. We can also share some with you. I think 2 years ago, we also had a session on disability inclusion where we went through quite a lot of resources and tips. So if you connect with us as well, we can share some of those with you. And I think there are quite a lot of resources and maybe books that you're also able to find, and organizations that actively, work with this, connect with practitioners like Bernard, for example, and learn. But I know there are quite a number of organizations that focus specifically on disability inclusion, and we can also send those recommendations if you connect with us.
If I may add, we also had a panel discussion on the topic of neurodiversity. So you can find that on our YouTube channel or also on our podcast.
Yeah, I'm typing things in the chat for some of the people we have partnered with in Avanade when we talk about neurodiversity in the workplace. Professor Amanda Kirby has done several sessions for us. She has worked with a guy called Theo Smith. They have written a book, and it's like I'm putting them in the chat to see if that's if those are also resources that we have liked when it comes to this.
That would be great. And maybe somebody like Miguel can collect it, because I think this person's question came from LinkedIn. So if they connect with us, we can send it to them.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you, for answering this question. And I think we do have 3 minutes left, and there's a last question in here, at least for now, from Beth on LinkedIn. What are some examples of microaggressions towards people with disabilities, and how can we call them out or call them in an empathetic way? Can you think of some forms of microaggressions?
So going back to my to my example about prioritization, if the answer is, well, every adult can prioritize, how hard can it be? Not necessarily just the microaggression is pretty hard aggression, but when you're hearing those kinds of things, or as Chisholm was kind of referring to, everybody knows that ADHD people are so and so, which isn't, and it's, even if you haven't told anybody that you have that condition, it will hurt, and call them out or call them in, totally depending on the context. We talked a little bit about this earlier as well. It's like the first time I would probably raise it in private, and then if it continues, it's like you will be called out in front of a group if you don't really understand the problem here.
Thank you so much for answering our last question. Kaisa, we only have 1 minute left, so I think we can just gracefully end this amazing panel discussion without rushing through the last thank yous. So yes, I would like to take my time to give a big thanks to our panelists, Bernard Chira, Kaisa Levick, and Chisom Udeze. Thank you so much for taking the time and spreading your knowledge about this topic. There's, we need to have these conversations more and more. So thank you so much for joining us today. And of course, a big thank you also goes out to our participants, our audience, who have been again engaged very much in this conversation. We are looking forward to seeing you again next month at our next DI session, which will be on the topic of anti-Blackness. So again, a very big topic to discuss together. So until then, have a great rest of April, a great May, and see you soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Bernard, and thanks, Kaisa. Really appreciate your time.